Welcome into another edition of Press Box Live. I'm Stan the Fan Charles, and just want to announce before we get into talking to our guest that the new Press Box is hit the streets. We got the exclusive on talking David Rubenstein on the record. Glenn Clark and I chatted with him about a month ago about a whole host of topics, and we hope you enjoy it and all the rest of it. It's available out at over 500 locations, including 60 Royal Farm stores and also online at pressboxonline.com. With me now is one of my favorite journalists in town, is Jeff Zrebiec, who writes for The Athletic. Jeff, thank you very much for doing the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I know how busy you are, even though this is off season. For you, it's not quite off season. How busy are you this time of year?
Yeah, like Stan, I always think about this. The late great Mike Flanagan. We used to talk about this back in the day, even when I covered baseball. And he used to kind of talk about how ridiculous the word off season is, and he referred to it as the game season and the non-game season.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So we're in the non-game season, and yeah, it's the NFL is so, it's a 12 month a year thing nowadays, right? I mean, they've made sure of that. There's something going on at all times. If it's not this season, it's free agency, it's the draft, it's roster stuff, it's the schedule release. Really, the only quiet time is when you finish that last mandatory mini camp in mid to late June, and you have that month walk up to training camp, and that's really kind of the only time where you get to take a breath. And even then, if there's a big contract issue or something off the field going on, it can be tough. But yeah, it's just different. You get into routine during the season where you know where you're going to be, you know where you have to be, you know exactly what you're going to write. Now is sort of like kind of, you have work to do, there's a lot of issues going on, there's things to do. You just don't know when. Like, I don't know exactly when the Ravens are going to start making roster cuts or do other salary cap machinations. I don't know when they're going to re-sign some guys and all that. Now I know I have to be in Indianapolis next week for the scouting combine. That's always kind of one of the more hectic weeks of the year, but yeah, it's just a different kind of busy, but there's no break. It's just, I
It's
remember leaving Buffalo not too long ago, and it's kind of been something constant pretty much every time since.
Yeah, yesterday was absolutely actually a month ago that they lost in Buffalo. Yeah. Uh, but things like knowing when you have open time to do stuff, it's much easier to know what your real schedule's like during the season, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You know where you're going to be now, even, and you and I talked about this when we're trying to get together on a couple things. It's, you commit to something and then you just don't know. And, I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and my 6-year-old is involved in a bunch of sports, Stan, and I'm sitting there on the side of the court as he practices basketball with my computer, and when he goes to tennis, I have my computer, and it's just like you just don't know. You try to work, you try to be available because anything can happen. And a story I like to tell. I was speaking at University of Maryland, a journalism class. This was several years ago, may have been DeCosta's first off season. And I'm talking to the kids, answering questions about kind of the 24/7 nature of the job. My phone is just blowing up in my pocket, and I didn't want to pull it out as I'm talking to the class, but it was a kind of a persistent buzz that you just say, so once we did a little break for the class, and then kind of we got back to it, but I stole a glance at my phone, and it was Eric Weddle telling me he had been released. And he wanted to give me the story first because I was close with Eric, and
Yeah.
I didn't get the story first because I was talking to a journalism class, but it was kind of a fun moment and a great lesson that night that, look, you don't know when some of this stuff is going to happen. I mean, in a lot of ways, the Ravens, and I wrote something about this today, that they're a deadline team, right? I mean, certain moves are pretty obvious, but they usually wait until they have to make them official. And so you don't expect them to be kind of among the first up on doing certain things, but you just never know. Things come up and kind of, spur decisions that they have to make sooner than they want to in certain cases. So yeah, but you just know you have to work, but you don't exactly know what that day is going to bring like you do during the season.
So, I read your piece today, and Jeff Wright covers the Ravens for the athletic.com, a subscription-based journalism piece that is absolutely fantastic. And Jeff does an incredible job covering the Ravens. Your piece today couldn't have been more well timed to have you on. You wrote about 9 particular ways that the Ravens can shave some money and get further under the cap, because I think they're under the cap now by like 6 million.
Yeah.
Can you explain to our viewers, and I need this lesson every year, like you wrote about cutting Millette and cutting Marcus Williams. What happens June 1st by waiting to June 1st?
Yeah, and you talked about perfect timing, Stan, and also since I wrote that, there's been kind of a report, not really a report. I guess the NFL has shared with teams that the cap's going to be even higher by quite a bit than everybody thought. The cap is coming in, and they don't haven't said exactly, but it's going to be much higher. So the Ravens are going to have a lot more room than it looked like. I mean, they're still going to be tight, but
Yeah.
they won't have to do the heavy lifting that we thought it was going to be if the cap came in at about 272 or 272.5, which was kind of the early projections. It's going to be much higher than that, which is good news for the Ravens, but it also means everyone else has a lot more money to spend too
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
on their players. So it works both ways. But yeah, by waiting to post June 1st, Stan, you can push off the dead money from the contract that you're getting out of into 2 years, right? So you
Okay.
don't have to
Right.
absorb it all at once. And as in the case with Marcus Williams or, maybe Justin Tucker, if that's the road we go down here, they can do that after June 1st, but you don't realize part of the salary cap savings also until after June 1st, which, is 3 or 4 weeks into free agency already. So, you know,
I've always wondered, when you get a player that has an off the field problem that the club really has nothing to do with causing. Do you think it's right that the club sort of gets penalized under the cap
it's
situation?
tough. Yeah, that's tough. I mean, you're talking about, especially for guys, we're talking about stuff that may not have been was years ago, long before he
Yeah,
signed this contract. And that's the kind of stuff that comes up and I'm not just saying about this one incident, but just league wide, what you're kind of getting at it. That can have a dramatic impact on the salary cap and people that you don't anticipate. Certain things, certain bills are going to come due. When something like that happens, that really throws things for a loop and really impacts it. And it is interesting. That is a real tough draw for certain teams to have to accept that.
yeah. I mean, it's equal for everybody, but it seems like because it's equal for everybody, every team would love to get out from under certain contracts that they've had nothing to do with having to release a player like Justin Tucker. Um, do you think that it will come down to being a pretty simple decision, even though it seems like it's dragging on right now, that the club will part company with Justin Tucker?
Ooh. That's a good question. And let me preface it, Stan, by saying, look, this is a Steve Bisciotti call. When a
Yeah,
decision goes like that, John Harbaugh have an input and Shashi Brown and Eric DaCosta, but ultimately it's Steve Bisciotti that's going to have to make this call. Often they're all in agreement on it, but he has the ultimate say so. And when the story originally broke, and all credit to the Baltimore Banner for their reporting, I think there was an idea that this was a formality, that it's just only a matter of time.
yeah,
I never got that sense, Stan. Now, I'm not saying he's safe or everything was
right.
fine, nor am I dismissing the severity of the allegations. I just don't think it was as open and shut, like, okay, they're just waiting to the right time to release him, or and here, since that happened, there's been a bunch more accusers to come forward to the point we're up to 16 now. And I think there's still that attitude. Like, what are they waiting for? Like, they're going to move on here. Just do it. That may well be what happens, Stan. But I also think there's a sense of, look, the NFL is investigating this. Let the NFL have its investigation. Let's learn as much as possible. Let's give as much time to come forward for us to learn the facts, for the league to learn the facts, for the any potential legal process. Now, who knows if there's even going to be a legal process in this case because the whole statute of limitation. So let's let that play out. Let's not make a rash decision. And I think that's where we're at now. But I will say this, Stan, at some point, is Steve Bisciotti just going to say, look, this is embarrassing. This is terrible. We're taking hits left and right on this. These allegations are awful. Like, what are we doing here? Let's move
Yeah,
on. I mean, you can't officially cut him, under a post-June, first release until till after then. But you certainly can distance yourselves by saying we are planning to release Justin Tucker. And we've
right.
seen that many teams do that before, and they have not done that yet, which to me tells you they're still very much in evaluation mode.
I go back to the Ray Rice situation. Certainly, the situations are different in certain ways. But I remember one key moment that came out later after they released Ray Rice, and it was something to the effect of the state police guy talking to Dick Cass, and the state police guy said, "You don't want to see this video." And apparently, the Ravens never looked at the video until it got released. Is there a chance in hell that the Ravens haven't known about these allegations and his being banned from a couple of these establishments like 6, 7 years ago?
The Ravens have the security team, and
Sure.
they know everybody in town, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's their job, and they're very close to the players. They're very close to people who do work for the players and all that. So I don't know. I mean, you'd like to think that they know all this stuff, but there's also just kind of been some inconsistencies about, who knew what and when, and was he banned from these places, and when was he banned? And he is adamant that he never was notified he was banned from any of them. So there's all that, and I know people are saying now, Stan, that this was the worst kept secret in Baltimore. I
Yeah.
never heard it.
I never heard it either.
I know I don't
Right.
frequent downtown Baltimore health clubs, and that's not really my scene. And I don't need, I don't get really massages either. I like being I'm not making light of it here, but so I don't know that really. I'm not in that world, but I didn't hear anything until you started seeing stuff in December when he was missing
Yeah.
kicks, and then you saw some stuff pop up on message boards and other things, and people kind of connecting the dots. That's the first I heard about any of this.
Let me do this spot for the Costas Inn who brings you this, and then we'll finish up with some real football kind of related stuff, not the off the field stuff. The Costas Inn, located for over 50 years at 4100 North Point Boulevard. Everybody knows them as an elite crab house. 410-477-1975 is the number. You need to reserve your crabs, find out the price point, the availability. So call that number, 410-477-1975. Exciting news coming as the Costas Inn is going to open in Timonium, their second location, around April 1st. They're taking over the food place inside the OTB at Timonium at the fairgrounds. All right. That's the Costas Inn, and they sponsor each and every one of these Press Box Lives. Jeff, your piece today on theathletic.com, you mentioned a couple things. Mark Andrews, it's hard for me to imagine that the club will move on, trade, or waive him or release him, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing about the Ravens though is they don't get overly sentimental in certain situations, and business has to happen. And at
I
some point,
understand
I
that.
also don't think they're going to want to move. The Ravens do not like moving on or losing ascending players and young like. And is there room for both Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely? And if you sign Andrews to an extension, which probably would make the most sense in terms of
Yep.
him staying because it's going to be tough to keep him on this current deal. Like what does that mean for Likely? So, I mean, first of all, I don't get the release. I know people are calling for that. I don't care about $11 million. $11 million, and you just lost your Lamar Jackson's one of his close friends, his favorite targets, and one of the people that opposing defenses have to prepare for every week to stop your offense. And you also lost the guy who means so much to the locker room and the community. I don't feel that at all. I don't think that even should be an option. But the question is here going forward. I mean, the Ravens have this setting or have this saying, it's better to move on a year too early and a year than a year too late. And if you can't get anything done with him, or you just want to instead focus on Isaiah Likely, you're basically going to lose him for a comp pick next year.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I just don't
so
see it happen. Don't
yeah,
see
I
it
mean,
happen.
and the other thing is, I think some people took it as it's more likely they move on after what happened in Buffalo. I say the opposite. It's less
Yeah.
likely move on because it looks like they're scapegoating him, and the
Yeah.
Ravens do not do that. Do not behave in that way.
Does this cap figure being higher than anticipated help this situation?
100%, 100%. When the Caps number, like his number, and well, first of all, even with that cap number, they still got to get money, and I don't like to report or ahead of time like formalities and say, oh, this guy's going to be gone, this guy's going to be gone. But I mean, I think the Marcus Williams thing is as good of a formality as it gets, and Arthur Millette makes sense too to move
No
on
question
there.
about those two. Yeah.
So you got that. I think Derrick Henry's probably the easiest move you can make, and as far as he wants to be here, that's not a guy that's showing any signs of slowing down. They love him. Get that deal done. You'll get some more money there. So there's ways to do it where you just bring Mark Andrews back and you can make a decision later. That helps.
Yeah.
Every little dollar that the cap is higher than they thought helps in that regards with some of the players that were having big numbers.
Is as you wrote in your piece, it's just 2 years ago that Eric DaCosta was negotiating
No.
with Lamar. Is that the last possible way for him that he wants to go down that road? Is it just easier to try and accomplish some of this cap space? And now with the cap going up, just not even full with that right now.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, well, you get that done and you pretty much got all the savings you need, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And you don't have to worry about, all right, Marlon Humphrey on that contract. Okay, who cares? We're fine. We have
yeah,
enough.
right.
But that's not the easiest way to get that done. I mean, that's a very complicated thing, and negotiating quarterback deals are very complicated. And unless Eric DeCosta's been spending time in South Florida with Lamar or wherever Lamar is nowadays, that's not something that you can just snap and say, okay, we're going to get that done first and everything else will fall into place. So, yeah, I would think, but I will say this, with his cap number in the mid 70s the next 2 years, they
Right.
have to get that deal done at some point before next offseason. Or we're going to be having that same conversation at this time next year, but the urgency will have picked up dramatically.
All right. So that's an interesting timing thing for that. You mentioned extending Ardarius Washington. He really came on and was an effective player. Do you think that's in the cards that they could look to do that?
Yeah, I think so. He's a restricted free agent, and in order to kind of protect yourself from losing him, I think you probably got to put the second round tender. I doubt any team is going to be willing to give up a second round pick and give him that kind of deal. I mean, they'd draft their own safety in the second round if they wanted to do that. I mean, but yeah, like this is a guy we see it all the time. They like to reward guys like this, the
Yeah.
guys that they find as undrafted free agents, start off maybe playing a little special teams and then emerge as key players for them. I mean, this kind of situation plays out all the time. And I would think they would love to have Ardarius Washington going forward as part of the mix. And he doesn't even have to be a safe. I mean, I think they liked him better as a nickel guy, in there. But just how the season went mandated he kind of went back to safety. But they love the versatile DBs. We see it all the time. I think they very much view him as being part of this. And if they could get a deal done were to get him under contract for a couple more years while also kind of maybe giving themselves a couple more million to play with on this year's cap, I think it would be good for both parties.
Jeff, you've been around sports long enough to know I'm going to talk about David Ajabo right now.
Hmm.
Uh, in sports, the guy that drafts somebody in football seems to be incredibly loyal to that player.
Yeah.
Just like in baseball, I'll never forget the first move that Sid what was his name?
To thrift.
Sid Thrift made once he took over for after Pat Gillick, and then the guy they got forgot his name too now. Boy, I'm showing my age. But anyway, was when they immediately traded Jason Worth, who had been a Pat Gillick draft pick, but people that draft somebody are very loyal to them. I thought your the way you wrote it up on a Jabo, that it might make more sense to really give him one more run
Yeah.
this year in training camp to see if he's learned something, if he's better. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think every year,
Well, you're agreeing with yourself. You wrote it down.
well, yeah, like I just think first of all, we see it all the time. Guys pop, right? And Ravens are have a number of stories of guys popping in their contract year,
Yep.
and like why not? I mean, it's 1.8 of savings. You're not exactly teaming with outside linebacker depth at the moment. There should be plenty of snaps to give him this summer. He just hasn't been very healthy. So if you want to say, well, he's entering his fourth year, but how many of those years has he had interrupted? Maybe this is the second. The only thing I could say differently, I mean, they're with him every day, and Chuck Smith is a foremost pass rush coach. Obviously you take his opinion. If he
Yeah.
thinks the light's going to come on and there's still an upside there that he could kind of become a 6 to 8 sack guy next year for that kind of money, yeah, you don't even consider it. Now, if Mike McDonald, who coached, Jabo at Michigan, tells his GM to get on the phone with DaCosta and let's offer him a pick, and then you get a
Right.
pick plus the 1.8 of savings, then I think I'd be more open to it. But generally, I don't see the point unless you're getting this huge savings of moving on from a guy at his rookie contract at this point of the year, at this point of the offseason. At least let him come to camp and take another look at him.
And take one more look at it. Last thing I got for you, Jeff, and I'm very appreciative of your time. The signing of Chuck Pagano to come back to Baltimore. You feel good about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chuck is the charisma and the experience and sort of the motivational ability, I think will help John Harbaugh,
Yeah.
one. And two, I just think he's a very good football coach and a very good person. And I
Right.
think I think you need those guys. I think he's going to help Zach Orr too. They're bullish about Zach Orr, but they also understood it was going to take a while, and there
Yeah.
was going to be certain things he'd have to learn on the fly, and we saw that last year. But for much of this past season, and I'm not pointing any fingers, but they underachieved in the secondary. They have when I say assets, I mean cap space and draft picks. And they had far too many assets tied up in that secondary to have the 32nd ranked pass defense for basically 2/3 of the year.
Yeah.
That group underachieved this past year, played a lot better towards the end and was kind of rounded into form. But I think when you struggle that much with the amount of assets in that group, you're going to see changes, and thus Doug Mallory and Chris Hewitt exited, and Chuck Pagano is here. And I thought Chuck was happily retired. I didn't think
Yeah.
he'd want to come back, but I think it's a coup to get him, back. And then you still have Dean Pease around, maybe lesser hands-on,
Yep.
lesser daily, but still only a phone call away, and will still be involved with different things. His son is going to be on the staff now, Dean's son. So yeah, I like what they've done, and I thought all along, Stan, the underrated part of last year was the defensive coaching losses and the brain drain that left that between McDonald and Anthony Weaver and Denard
Sure.
Wilson. And I think we saw that for the first couple months of the season defensively. Not having as many changes and having some guys back that have been there, I think that'll help this group start from a little higher place than they did last year.
I left one thing out, a big ticket item. Ronnie Stanley. Is this new cap figure, is it a possibility that helps bring him back, or you think they're more inclined to not pay what he can get out on the open market?
If it's not Andrews, it's Stanley in terms of just being the toughest decision I think
Yeah,
Eric DeCosta
yeah,
has to make. Because at this time last year, we're all, there are people saying, like, why are they paying Ronnie Stanley at all? He never
right,
practices. He's going to
right.
play. Now, all of a sudden, it's like after one 17-game season, you can't let that guy walk out the door. And yet, if he gets hurt in July, everyone's going to be like, they should have known, they should have never paid him.
Right.
That's just sort of, I mean, the DaCosta doesn't get paid to listen to that stuff, but
Yeah,
I'm just saying, I just think that's a very difficult call. And Stan, you got almost a dozen tackles right now in the NFL. I think it is exactly a dozen, 12 tackles who are making 20 million on average per year. And you may say, okay, but Ronnie's 31's had extensive injury history. Well, six of those 12 are in their 30s right now who are making that.
yeah,
And now you're also going to see this cap hike. Teams are going to have more money and more space than they know what to do with. I think I saw the Raiders have 100 million of cap space,
whew,
and the Steelers have 60 million, I think I saw. And, like it's not going to hurt them to throw a little extra money at Ronnie Stanley. So it's hard to imagine you're going to get a discount on him now.
yeah, yeah,
And he took a 7.5 million pay cut last year. He left money on the table, bet on himself,
right.
and it worked out for him. And he's going to make all that back this year. I don't know, man. I just would have a hard time seeing that they'd be up in that area for him,
Yeah,
knowing how, knowing his history and knowing they found a pretty good tackle in the second round last year, and
yeah.
they've wanted to kind of get younger anyway along that group.
All right. Great stuff as always. He's writes for theathletic.com. He's Jeff Zrebiec. Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Want to remind you, we've been brought to you by the Costas Inn. Grab the new press box out on the streets today. On the record, our discussion with David Rubenstein, the owner of the Baltimore Orioles. Again, many thanks to Jeff Zrebiec of The Athletic. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
Talk soon.